co-funded by the European Union. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the authors only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union. Neither the European Union nor the granting authority can be held responsible for them.
Today in the EU, concerns over Commission's loosening environmental requirements for farmers. We talked a lot about farmers this month on the podcast, and we know that the Commission is making proposals to appeal to farmers and pacify the situation a little bit, and much of that is actually related to environmental matters. Hello and welcome. I am Evdikiori, and this is Today in the EU. We invited Maria Simon Arboleas in our studio to talk about the meaning of the European Commission's decision. Maria, you've been following this very closely. You've also been covering the protests. Can you explain to us exactly what is going on there?
Yes, so since the start of 2024, there have been protests in almost every European country. And of course, there were demands specific to member states. So, for example, in Germany, the demonstrations were triggered by the government's decision to abolish tax exemptions on fuel and agricultural vehicles. But there were also common concerns across the bloc. And one of them was precisely bureaucracy in the EU's farming subsidies scheme, which you know is the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. And as the EU has tried to move towards a greener CAP, a lot of focus and emphasis has been put precisely on the environmental requirements.
Much of it regards the European Common Agricultural Policy. Can you give us a brief overview of the changes that the Commission has proposed?
Of course. So for a bit of context, the current CAP, which covers years from 2023 to 2027, has strengthened this environmental conditionality. So there are green requirements on which the payments to farmers depend. These practices, for instance, contribute to soil health, like crop rotation. But this set of standards, called GAECs, so Good Agricultural and Environmental Conditions, have some rules. And the Commission has proposed to relax these rules to ease the burden to farmers, and has also given member states more flexibility when implementing this policy. And additionally, there's an exemption for farms, small farms with less than 10 hectares, from these checks on compliance.
You reported that the European Parliament is really trying to speed up this approval process. Can you tell us a bit on how this is actually going to happen?
On the 19th of March, the coordinators of the political groups in the European Parliament decided to use an urgent procedure, which means that the plenary will be able to approve these measures a bit quicker. This means we can expect a vote on the 10th or 11th April, which we know is the next to last session for the European Parliament before the election.
Yes, they're trying to wrap up everything before the June parliamentary elections and the end of this mandate.
Yeah.
Do you think this will cause any trouble politically?
So this is a question that has been raised by many, because it's no secret that in the run-up to the elections, political parties have been giving farmers a bit more attention than usual. So, for example, Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen, in the launch of her campaign in early March, spend much time talking about farmers, and precisely my colleague has written about this. You can check her story on the farming queen, as she called her. But it is not only the EPP, of course, that wants to label itself as the party of farmers. It's also the socialists, the Greens. They have all made pleas to ease farmer consent, and of course far-right politicians who have tried to position themselves at the forefront of this protest that we were talking about. And this is no small question, of course. We also reported on a study by the Committee of the Regions that concerns that farmers are going to be a very important poll for far-right parties because of rural areas being neglected and so on. So of course, answering to your question, there is the risk of MEPs trying to seek immediate political gains instead of looking more in the long-term perspective and making thoughtful decisions regarding the CAP. And it is not only MEPs, by the way. It's also national leaders in the council, because of course they have been the ones facing at the national level these protests.
The reason why, member states and also behavior of some members of the parliament recently on agri files or agri-related files are driven by electoral considerations, and because the elections are approaching. And it is very concerning, of course, because we see an instrumentalization from far-right parties of the protests of the farmers. I mean, I'm originally from France, and it is very strong in France, and it is very, very concerning. And I think that, if we link it to agriculture, I think it's even more concerning because one has to remember that these parties, even though they have softened their message a little bit since Brexit, they are not pushing for more EU or anything like that. Those who might think that it's useful to have their voices and them, standing with them and defending their interests, etc., need to think twice because they are not going to push for more EU. This might impact the common agricultural policy. And as we have said before, having 27 national policies would not be the way forward, certainly not in terms of administrative burdens as well and discrepancies.
Said Faustine Bas-de-Fosset, Director for Nature, Health and Environment at the European Environmental Bureau. Who will be pushing for approval and who will be resisting in the Parliament?
So some things are clear already. A liberal and right-wing majority is expected to make this happen. Of course, on the other side, there's the Greens and the left opposing it. But it is a bit unclear for the socialists because some have been pushing for these changes, for these to happen, the simplification package, but others have warned against the potential implications for the environment, for example.
Also, NGOs, civil societies and environmental associations didn't exactly welcome these developments with open arms, I would say. What is the counter-argument from that side of the table?
There are several arguments here. First, they said that red tape or bureaucracy is being used as a scapegoat. So NGOs are not against simplification per se, but they said that this goes beyond making things easier, and that is indeed a rollback from the CAP's green ambition. They're also concerned about the fact that there is no impact assessment to these changes. The Commission justified this by pointing to political urgency. They mentioned, of course, the war against Ukraine and the impact on prices, trade flows, and so on, but paradoxically also climate change. So the Commission said that it's precisely environmental threats that make it more difficult for farmers to comply with regulations. So now we're talking about extreme weather events and so on. And NGOs say that this is basically hypocrisy, right? That precisely because of climate change, farmers need to comply with regulations. So it's like a vicious cycle here, as you can see.
And what could the consequences of these changes be?
So, as I have said, there was no impact assessment, so I am not in a position to anticipate the impact that this can have on the environment, but I can make a couple of forward-looking points.
Sure, please.
Because, for example, NGOs said that this puts into question the legitimacy of the common agricultural policy.
Why is that?
Because it is taxpayers' money that we're talking about, that will be spent with less strict requirements, as they say. So this is, for example, what Faustine told me during our conversation.
Unfortunately, the environmental requirements and the so-called red tape have become somehow scapegoats, which in a way is making us moving away from the actual solutions that we should all focus on, and certainly the wrong ones. It's true that we have seen protests all across the EU, and it is not over. But these protests are not due to the environmental requirements. They are actually the result of a broken system that farmers are stuck within for too long now. Farmers have been faced with contradictory injunctions for too long, where they are asked to produce more and more, and while they are faced with depleting natural resources and more challenges when it comes to climate change.
On the other hand, we know that conversations on the future common agricultural policy are already happening. There is this strategic dialogue going on that was launched by von der Leyen. So this is also an opportunity to reflect on what farmers expect and will ask for. And in my conversation with Diana Lenzi, she's a farmer.
Diana is also the former president of SEJA, the European Council of Young Farmers organization.
She was worried about the EU forgetting the original purpose of the CAP, which was first and foremost to ensure a living for farmers, a fair income.
Let's listen to Diana.
As much as I completely agree that our biggest issue is that the food system is broken, we still have to remember kind of why the CAP exists and what is its scope and how has it managed to basically fail all of its basic scopes at this point. And so we have a lot of contradictory objectives, and I I have a feeling that more instruments we try to squeeze into the cap, or more we try to make the cap something it's not, the more we're actually going to go away from the objective that actually everybody wants to achieve. I mean, I strongly believe that every single farmer in the EU believes that transitioning to a more sustainable farming practice is important, that there are margins through which they can better themselves, they can contribute to the mitigation of climate change, and they want the mitigation of climate change on a larger scale. What we see is that the pressure is being put on the farmers through measures that do not guarantee in any way that they will obtain the objectives for which they're there.
So as you can see, she doesn't question the transition towards sustainability, but she says that the EU is trying to squeeze maybe too many ambitions in one single policy.
The cap, again, wants to kind of be the overall umbrella, and sometimes in being a very overall umbrella, it's also very... Then everything that comes to the application of the cap needs to be regulated by the internal bodies. Also, with the new experiment that we did within this cap of having member states kind of send in their national strategic plans, it's an experiment that in theory I think would have been incredibly positive, because it could have really helped member states to kind of tailor some of the needs and kind of shift the budget within those needs to the specific needs of the country. Unfortunately, I think it kind of increases the divide between the more bureaucratical, efficient countries and the ones that are bureaucratical nightmares.
And if we were to keep a key takeaway from this, what would that be?
Well, we know it's a very polarized topic, maybe in this context even more. So sometimes some nuances get lost in the conversation. So we can maybe remind a couple of points here. For example, it is the responsibility of member states to implement the cap and also to establish how burdensome the requirements end up being for farmers. So both Diana and Faustine in our conversation acknowledged this, and both were concerned about giving countries precisely more flexibility, because they said this can result in fragmentation and also like a bigger divide between countries that are more efficient in bureaucracy and those that are less efficient. We also know that not everything is black or white. Both Diana and Faustine talked about the problems in the food chain and were very concerned about the fact that farmers do not get a fair remuneration for their products. They are regarded as the less powerful across the supply chain. And this is precisely a problem that the Commission has pledged to work on. But maybe this is the topic for another episode.
Thank you, Maria, for being with us today. I am Evikiori, and this was Today in the EU. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.